for the first 5 years, we made no revenue, like $0.
Obviously, you guys had layoffs, and there have been reports that it's due to your increased reliance on AI. Do you have any commentary in regard to that?
There was no single Duolingo full-time employee laid off.
Elon Musk recently said that AI will surpass human intelligence by the end of 2025. Agree or disagree? Hello, I'm Ruth Umoh, leadership editor and host of Fortune Executive Exchange. I'm joined today by Severin, co-founder and CTO of the popular language learning app Duolingo, to discuss how AI can help with learning new languages, its popular owl mascot Duo, and why the company is now offering math and music lessons. Before we dive in, don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment below to share your thoughts on this conversation. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining Fortune Executive Exchange. I often interview Fortune 500 CEOs, C-suite executives, but it's particularly insightful to speak with founders and co-founders like yourself who can speak to how they brought their vision for the company to life. Talk to me about Duolingo's genesis. How did it come to be?
Yes, so by the way, my name is Severin Hacker. It's like Severin.
Great
like
name.
Severin,
Great name
without
for
a
a
G,
tech guy.
and hacker, like computer hacker. It's my real last name, in case you were wondering. So my story is I grew up in Switzerland, so I'm Switzerland over there.
The French
small
side
town.
or the German side?
The German-speaking side, yeah,
okay.
yeah, close to Zurich, but a very small town. Yeah. And I grew up there, did all of my schools and all of that there. I went to university there as well, and then I've always wanted to study in the U.S. So when the opportunity arose to study in the U.S. for an exchange year, I took it and went to Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh. And at Carnegie Mellon University, I met my eventual co-founder. He was not my co-founder at the time, but he was a young professor. In fact, I think he was the youngest professor at Carnegie Mellon in computer science at the time. And I really wanted to meet him, and I had a list of people I wanted to meet, and he was near the top of that list. I'm not sure if it was on the top, but I wanted to meet him. And I walked to his office, and I actually remember this, and he remembers it, and he quotes it frequently. I went to his office and introduced myself exactly the way I just did, like a Severin hacker. And it kind of stuck with him, and he, I guess, I pitched a project to him, and he said, like, you should stay here. You should come to Carnegie Mellon University and become my PhD student. And
was that project Duolingo?
No,
okay.
not
Separate.
at all. No, I mean, somewhat related, but quite different. So I did that. I applied to the PhD program, got in, and then about 2 years into the program, we started working on what eventually turned into Duolingo. So
you're working through your PhD program. You have this interesting idea. Did you know at the time, let's say 2011, I think is when you officially launched the company. Did you know that a decade later or so you'd be IPOing?
No.
What was the mindset back then?
No, the mindset, it was a research project. We actually got research funding, like an NSF grant for this research project, but it got bigger and bigger. And at some point we had like 8 people, I believe, within the university work on this project. And at some point the university told us, you guys are running a company within the nonprofit university. You can't do that. So they said, you have to leave. They kicked us out. So we got kicked out of the university, and we went and raised money, and that was the beginning of Duolingo.
Why this focus on language proficiency in particular? I mean, I know in Switzerland there are about 4 national languages. Was that the onus? I mean, why focus on learning languages?
Yeah, so we started with languages because a combination of things. One of them is we both had to learn English. So my co-founder, Luis, he's from Guatemala. So his native language is Spanish. And I'm from Switzerland. My native language is Swiss German or German. And we both had to learn English. We're actually, neither of us is very good with languages. I think he's better, but I'm really quite bad with languages. So we were just like, okay, well, at least something that we had to learn ourselves. So we thought like, we can teach English. We can teach English. We can teach German and Spanish at least. That was one thing. The other reason was that languages is one of the few subjects people study outside of school. So inside and outside of schools, versus say math is something that people mostly study within schools. And it's a lot easier if you can teach something that people already learn outside of schools. So that's why we started with languages.
As I noted already, you made your public market debut in 2021, July of 2021. As you scaled from a small startup to a public company, was there one crucible moment, one defining decision you made that really helped to accelerate the company's growth?
Yeah, it's interesting. So it was a roller coaster. It really and
what do you mean by that?
The ups were really high and the lows were really low. And for the first 5 years, we made no revenue. Like $0. And we always were able to raise more money based on our user numbers. So we had lots of interest and lots of users, millions of users, and it just grew very rapidly in the user numbers, but we didn't know how to monetize. And we just like, you know what, when you run out of money, we'll just go and raise more money. That was kind of like our, and I think a lot of our investors believed that we would eventually just sell to Google. So my co-founder had sold 2 previous companies to Google, so they expect we would sell again, to Google or something. But that was not actually our intention. Our intention was to build a sustainable business with this mission. But we struggled a lot with monetization, and we're a mission-based company. So our mission is to provide the best education and make it universally accessible, which means for us that we don't want to charge for content, because when you charge for content, you actually exclude a lot of people from that content. So that is very important to us. So how do we monetize without charging for content? And eventually we found this current business model, which is a freemium subscription business model, which is very good for the business, but is aligned with our mission as well.
Yeah. So you monetize it now by having a free tier, if I'm correct, and then users can also pay to access additional content. Is that correct?
It's not actually additional content.
Okay.
So all the content is available in the free tier.
Yeah.
You can learn a language with Duolingo without ever paying. You can do that. The way it works is there's a free tier and there's a paid tier. It's called Super. And in Super, you have a bunch of extra features. Also in the free tier, you have ads. So in the paid tier, we remove that. It's more similar to Spotify, for example.
Did you ever think of selling to Google or some other huge tech corporation?
Well, so my co-founder, he had 2 previous exits, so he didn't need, he didn't need to prove himself or needed more money necessarily. I didn't have that. This is my first company. It's actually my first job, my first full-time job. So, but no, we wanted to go all the way. Yeah.
And you certainly did. AI is obviously the topic du jour right now. How is Duolingo using the technology, which is still relatively nascent, although it is quickly evolving?
Yeah, so for Duolingo, it's not day one in terms of AI.
Yeah.
Like we started from day one, we wanted to use technology to teach better. And if you look at what is the best way to learn, math, music, golfing, it doesn't matter what. The best way to learn is with a one-on-one tutor. Not just any one-on-one tutor, but like the best one-on-one tutor. The problem with that is the best one-on-one tutor is very expensive. It's not accessible. So the promise of technology and AI as part of that technology is that you can reach that level of efficacy with AI and technology, but actually make it accessible to everyone. And that's what we're working on. So,
do you think we can 5 to 10 years from now? As you look in your crystal ball.
I would like to get to that level. It's definitely looking more likely than 5 years ago with the breakthroughs in AI. But the thing we're basically working on for a long time now is personalization. So what's important for learning is that you're always working at the right difficulty level, right? So content is not too easy and not too hard. So you're like in this optimal zone of difficulty. And we have a model, like a machine learning model, that we trained on billions of data sets, like data points, on millions of users every day, that basically allows us to personalize your lessons in Duolingo so that they're always in the right difficulty zone. And that's been going on for quite a while now. The way you can think of it is like, TikTok is like really good at personalizing for what you like. Like I like this video, I don't like this video, and every time you scroll through, you basically create data points for TikTok to optimize it better for you. What our model does is basically TikTok for recommending what to do in terms of maximizing your learning outcome. So it's TikTok for learning, like recommendations for learning, not TikTok for entertainment.
But it is gamified, Duolingo is, so there is some type of entertainment aspect to it.
Absolutely. So we don't have the luxury of a formal school system where you basically have to go, right? You have to go, and there's like all these mechanisms.
Well, you sent me the streak alerts, and so it feels like I have to continue my streak.
Are they working?
It is working.
Okay. So yeah, we don't have that luxury. So we have to basically work our way. Like how do get people to do something they want to have the long-term goal, right? They want to achieve the long-term goal. They want to learn the language, but they don't actually want to spend the next 5 minutes on this. So how do we hack the brain to get them actually to do this healthy habit?
There have been reports, obviously you guys had layoffs, a lot of tech companies have had layoffs, and there have been reports that it's due to your increased reliance on AI. Do you have any commentary in regard to that, and how do you find the balance between what AI can do and also ensuring that you're creating or maintaining, life-sustaining jobs for employees?
Yeah, so before we get into that,
Sure.
A clarification, there was no single Duolingo full-time employee laid off. Like no employee was laid off. What happened was we had a 10% reduction in our contractor force. So no full-time employee was laid off. Now, the reason we had this reduction in the contractor workforce is some of it is because of AI, and some of it is from other efficiencies. So to get back to your question, like how does AI affect the labor force, et cetera. Right now, at Duolingo, what I can tell you is that we're actually hiring a lot of people. So we're hiring across all functions in all of our offices across the world.
You touched on how you're using AI to personalize the platform. Talk to me about how you're using AI to augment or maybe to get rid of tedious tasks or to increase productivity. Where are you seeing the most efficiency as it relates to talent?
So we use, so the way we want to use AI is to teach better.
Yeah.
That's the main thing. Okay, so how can you teach better? And there's like multiple ways you can use AI to help us teach better. One of them is building AI features that you previously couldn't build. There's like a kind of like a chatbot, right? So we have a feature like that. It's called role play. So you're actually in a scenario like in a restaurant where you interact with the server and you ask for a drink or something, and you interact in the language that you're learning. And that is something that's now possible that 5 years ago was not possible. So that's one way of using AI to help you learn. And then there's ways you can use AI to make the operation more efficient. You can use AI to produce some of the content. What we have actually found so far is that it's still not as good as human-made content. So often, most of our content is still, there's a human in the loop. So for the creativity, the quirkiness that you see in Duolingo, I think there's still human in the loop.
Your mascot is quite famous. Great marketing strategy. When did you decide to introduce the owl as your mascot, and why?
Oh, that's a good story. So that was very early on. It was actually my co-founder. He said we need to have a mascot. I don't know actually why he thought we needed a mascot, but anyway, he thought we needed to have a mascot, and we hired a design agency to help us with the mascot, and they said we're actually not your mascot partner. We can help you with the design of the first prototype, but we can't get you we can't make the mascot. So they outsourced that to another company, and they came back with two proposals. One was like a cute little robot, and the other one was this owl, not the current owl, like an earlier version of owl. It actually said Duo in its eyes. It was kind of cool. And we looked at the two proposals in the company, and we had basically everyone vote, and everyone in the company preferred the little robot. And it was like, oh yeah, we're gonna go with the little robot. And then Luis said, you know what, we should maybe ask some people outside of the company. So we asked all of our partners and friends, et cetera. And all of them said, like, you have to go with the little owl. So that's why I picked Owl.
Duolingo is also very popular on social media. Why do you think that is?
On social media. So that's another story. When we started, so Luis and I, we're both like engineering product minded people. For a long time, we were like very good at product and engineering and design. And we didn't really know how to do marketing. And we actually had a good PR team and PR worked quite well. But we just like, we wished we had good marketing. and then at some point, we hired a CMO, and she hired a lot of people, young talent, and we just let them go. It's like, here, as long as it's not in the product, because the product, no, you can't mess with the product. But as long as it's outside the product, you can basically do whatever you want. And so that's when I started using TikTok. Actually, we had, TikTok, before we used Owl, was extremely unsuccessful.
Interesting.
And then we had this mascot, the owl, the costume, appear in our TikTok, and since then it's been like a huge success. Yeah.
Interesting. You mentioned at the top of the conversation that
By the way, I don't understand why our TikTok is successful. I'm just surprised. Like both Luis and I think we're just like, we don't understand it.
Just great investment in a good social media manager.
Yeah.
Really that simple. You mentioned at the top of the conversation that, in building and scaling this company, there have been really high highs and some really low lows. Can you dig in deeper with some anecdotes and some of the lessons you've learned along the way from the challenges and also how you overcame those obstacles?
Yeah, let's see. People ask us often, like, what are mistakes you've made or you regret or something like that. And I think that we made 2 big mistakes, and Luis would probably agree with that. Ultimately, it all worked out, right? But I think we made 2 big mistakes. One was we waited with monetization for too long. So for too long, we treated it as kind of like an academic project and like a research project, and we just kind of like didn't take it serious enough. And in hindsight, we should have taken it more serious earlier.
How do you make the determination in the moment? Obviously, we're looking in hindsight, but I think this is probably, especially for people working in academia and doing research, when do you make the decision, okay, we got to make money. We have to start thinking about profitability.
Yeah, the weird thing at the time was this was a different era when profitability was not that important for venture-backed companies. It was just all grow, just grow. And I was always surprised by this. Our investors, they never urged us to, make money or run more profitably. I think some of it was self-serving, so they could keep investing and get a larger share. I mean, not all of them, but like some of them said, you should actually become more profitable. And then most others didn't care. They just keep growing. And that's what we did. So we kind of on our own said okay, now is the time. We have to do this. We have to become a real business, not just a fun research project.
But why then? Did anything spark that, or?
Well, we just didn't want to go raise another round, and I think we also I think we realized this could become really big. This could become really successful at some point, and if we want to stay independent, we have to be a sustainable business, so you have to have revenue.
And then, absolutely. And then you said there was a second
the second mistake is we waited too long hiring senior leaders. So for too long, we basically hired just the smartest people straight from college, new grads. This is my first job. I think of the first 20 employees, it was everyone's first job, except Luis's. It was just very junior, and it became very chaotic. And then we did eventually hire our current head of engineering. We hired her from Google, and she was actually the first experienced manager, and she put in structure and
the grown-up in the room.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the culture. How would you define the culture when you started, and then has it changed now that you're a public company? And if it hasn't, how do you maintain it as you grow?
Yeah, I would say the culture. So people always assume that the IPO is like this thing. It's like there's pre-IPO and there's post-IPO, and it's a different company. And that's actually not the case, at least not in our case. For us, I would say the culture changes with the size of the company, so how many employees you have, right? So up until 300 people, you can know everyone, and we knew everyone. Because people know you and you interact with them, and we were also, everybody was in Pittsburgh for a very long time. You interact with them inside the office, outside the office. There's just a lot of goodwill and good intentions, and kind of like culture just comes like naturally. And now it's a lot more, we're now more than 700 people, and now it's like everything requires a communication plan. I feel like so it's like, okay, if you really want the whole company to know something, you have to say this, there, then blah, blah, and it goes into the structure, and yeah, that is definitely different.
Requires a more concerted effort. So how would you define the company's culture now?
The company's culture now, okay. So we have these operating principles, and one of them, my favorite one, is take the long view. So this company is mission oriented, so vision is very important. But then it's also really focused on taking the long view. So not optimizing for next quarter's Wall Street results. Like that's not, we're not interested in that. Like how can you have the maximum impact 5, 10, 15, 20, 50 years from now? That's I think one thing that resonates with me a lot, and I think with a lot of people at Duolingo. Let's see. Another one is, we're very data-driven and experiment-driven. So we run a lot of experiments in the app, so on the product, and like the streak and all of that. All of these were experiments at some point, and that's how we've been able to make this product so engaging and have such a high retention. So. I'm not sure if that answers.
No, it did answer the question. Well, I mean, I think it's a perfect segue, and I'll use myself as an example. I am an avid Duolingo user, so I can speak from personal experience. I was born in Germany, don't speak it, my parents do, so I'm trying to learn the language, and I use Duolingo to do so. But I feel that at times it can feel a bit repetitive, and it's interesting you say that you're experimenting in ways to drive engagement and keep users on the platform longer. What does that look like in practice? That's some of that experimentation.
Yeah, so we experiment with, so first of all, we run these A/B experiments. So it's, where we put basically 50% of people into one condition, like control condition, and 50% into experiment condition. It's kind of like your high school science experiment. And then we look at the data, we wait for a couple of weeks and we look at the data and then see like, okay, this experiment is actually better than control. And what is an experiment? So we experiment with every single feature of the app. So the streak, for example, the streak mechanic is like every day you use Duolingo, you extend the streak by a day, right? But then you can also lose the streak, and then you can repair it, and you can have these streak freezes. Like all of these are like tiny details that actually matter. So if you just, a lot of our competitors, they copy our features, but they only copy the surface of the iceberg, and the value is actually in the whole thing. And you can't get there without experimenting. By the way, we also run experiments on the efficacy. So we want to teach you better, not just the engagement piece, but also the efficacy piece.
Interesting. Duolingo, if my numbers are correct, has more than 100 courses in more than 40 different languages. What's the most popular language users learn on Duolingo?
What's your guess?
I want to say English.
Yeah,
it is English. Okay. And number 2?
So English is by far the most popular language.
Yeah.
And it's learned from all sorts of other languages. So there's always from Spanish, etc. For people who know English, the most popular one is Spanish.
Interesting. What are you learning currently?
I'm actually learning Italian for my Italian trip, my trip to Italy in the summer.
And where are we in terms of proficiency?
Oh, I'm a beginner. I've actually tried it once last year. I love Italy, so.
What are your expansion plans geographically? Are there markets where you see untapped potential?
Yeah, I mean, there's, in Asia, we actually, we're definitely growing a lot there. So Japan, Korea, China, India.
Just a couple more questions here. Duolingo launched its music learning program late last year, so one can take piano lessons, for instance. Why this pivot to music, and do you see other areas for growth?
Yeah, so it's a expansion.
Yeah.
We're expanding to both math and music. Now, why math and music? We looked at a lot of subjects. We looked at coding and math, music, geography, history. You can teach almost anything, right? But the reason we started with math and music is because the Duolingo method, the way you learn languages on Duolingo, lends itself well to those two subjects. You can learn them on the phone, and you can learn it with this implicit learning method. So, if you use Duolingo, it's not explicit learning. We don't tell you like, okay, this is how you construct a sentence in French or in German. It's like you kind of pick it up on the go. I mean, we do have hints and tutorials in there as well, but it's mostly like learning by doing. And we believe, at least for some parts of math and for many parts of music, that method works too. And that's why we started with math and music.
Like I said before, I personally use Duolingo. I enjoy the thrill of maintaining my learning streak. So I have to ask you, what is your longest streak?
The longest streak on the platform or my longest streak?
Well, actually, both.
The longest streak on the platform, I don't know that. But it's very long, many years. Mine is, I think, about, I can look it up. My phone is over there. It's 1,550.
Not too shabby.
Yeah. So.
Have you checked in on the app today?
Not yet.
Well, don't let today be the day that you break it. A couple of just leadership-focused questions for you, rapid-fire style. What is your leadership style?
I would say it's hands-off. I actually have this principle that people quote inside the company. I'm not sure if I should say it here, but it's basically it's reduce, automate, delegate. So for everything you have to do, think of whether you actually have to do it. I think a lot of the times, you realize that if you think about it, it's like, no, this actually doesn't need to be done, or it's not important, and nobody actually should be working on this. So try to reduce that stuff. What you can't reduce or remove or eliminate, that try to automate it. Like try to see if you can, now with AI, whether you can use, write software or like whether it can be automated. So no human has to do it. And then the stuff that you cannot automate, that you should try to see whether you can delegate. And then really only work on the things only you yourself can do, or where you are the best person in the company.
How would you describe, well, I asked you the company culture question. So a better question that I like to ask co-founders and CEOs, as you think about your business, what keeps you up at night?
What keeps me up at night? Yeah, I sleep very well.
Great sleep hygiene.
Okay, so what keeps me up at night? I mean, right now, I do spend a lot of time thinking about AI, what it will do, to society, what it will do to the company, what it will do to my life, and other people's lives. I do spend a lot of time thinking about that. Right now, I'm a huge optimist, so I think it's going to be great for humanity if we have, the more AI, the better, basically.
How many languages do you know?
So I grew up in Switzerland. So Swiss German is my native language. I had to learn German in school, very similar. Okay, you can call it either one or two, depending if you ask a Swiss or a German. And then I had to learn French. My French is okay. It's not great. And then with Duolingo, I finished the Spanish course at some point. And then with Duolingo, I went back to French because I wanted to improve my French. And right now I'm learning Italian. But the Italian is really not good.
Do you see a lot of people who, let's say they studied a language in high school and college?
In English.
I would never have guessed. Do you see a lot of people, let's say they studied a language in college or high school, they haven't used it, but like somewhere in the back of their brain, they know a little French or whatever language they studied, and so they just come back to Duolingo as a refresher, if you will, not necessarily starting from the ground up.
Yes, that's a very common use case of Duolingo. That's actually also with French, that's my use case. And it's funny, it's not like learning to ride the bicycle that is like once you learn it, like you never forget. Languages are not like that. I mean, at least not for me. I forget them. But if you do practice a little bit, you can actually maintain it.
Final two questions. Elon Musk recently said that AI will surpass human intelligence by the end of 2025. Agree or disagree?
Was 2025?
By the end of 2025.
Disagree.
Disagree.
Yeah.
Maybe 2035?
Maybe, yeah. But 2025, I would disagree.
Fantastic. I guess I'll end with this question. What does success look like for you, however you choose to define it?
I think with Duolingo, we really, our mission is to provide the best education and make it universally accessible, right? That's the mission. If you actually look at how much, we cover of that education, we cover like a little bit of language learning, and that's our most advanced subject. And we're like with math and music, we're, tiny compared to language learning. But even language learning, if you actually look at what is education, it's like schools in the world. It's a huge industry. We cover like a tiny sliver. I think we're like, at 1% of what we could achieve with this company.
So Duolingo recently had an April Fool's prank, Duolingo On Ice. Any possibility that you'll actually bring that to life?
I actually don't know. Would you go?
I would, but you would have to be on ice. You and the owl together have to be on ice.